The first photograph disappeared sometime in February. I did not notice immediately. That was the part that still haunts me. 40 years of family pictures covered the walls of my house. Sandra's graduation portrait near the staircase. Richard holding Michael beside the lake. Claire in her ballet costume at age 9. The house had always felt alive because everywhere you looked, someone you loved was staring back at you. So when one photograph quietly vanished from the hallway table, I simply assumed I moved it while dusting. Normal mistake. Human mistake. I did not question it. 3 weeks later, another frame disappeared. Then another. Not dramatically, quietly, like objects slowly dissolving at the edges of your life. At first, I blamed grief. Richard's death still lived inside the house somehow. Some mornings, I walked room to room feeling disoriented by silence alone. So when I noticed empty spaces where photographs used to sit, I assumed exhaustion, distraction, memory, not my daughter. The first real alarm came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I walked into the living room carrying laundry and stopped cold beside the bookshelf. Where Richard's favorite photograph used to sit, there was now a white label, bold black lettering. Richard, husband. The laundry basket nearly slipped from my hands. I stared at the label for several long seconds while rain tapped softly against the windows behind me. Not a framed note. Not decoration, a label, like something inside a classroom or a hospital. Cold moved slowly through my chest. I looked around the room carefully, and suddenly I saw them everywhere. Claire, daughter. Ethan, grandson. Michael's son. Tiny white labels beneath family photographs all across the shelves. My stomach tightened painfully. No, 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 no. I set the laundry basket down slowly and walked toward the hallway. More labels. Wedding pictures. Holiday photos. Children's portraits. Every face now identified with printed names and relationships. The house no longer looked like a home. It looked like preparation. I stood frozen in the hallway while something cold and terrible unfolded slowly inside my chest. Then another realization surfaced. Sandra came over yesterday while I was at church. Of course, I grabbed my phone immediately. She answered on the second ring. "Hi, Mom." Normal voice, warm voice. That frightened me instantly. "What did you do to my photographs?" Silence, not confusion. Silence, then softly, "What do you mean?" "The labels." Another pause, too long. Just oh. As though labeling family members throughout someone's house might naturally require explanation later. I stared at the tiny label beneath Richard's photograph. Richard, husband. My husband reduced to categorized memory reinforcement. "What is this?" Sandra exhaled carefully. "It's just precautionary." Precautionary. Another beautiful word capable of enormous harm. I labeled the pictures to make things easier later. Later. The word hit me like ice water. Not now, not because of current problems. Later. The future version of me was already rearranging the present version's house. I gripped the phone tighter. "Easier for who?" Silence again. Then quietly, "For you." "No." I suddenly understood that tone. The same tone people use when explaining safety rails or medication schedules. Soft certainty. I stared toward Richard's photograph while grief and humiliation twisted together painfully inside my chest. "I know who my husband is." "Of course you do." "Then why label him?" The question sat silently between us, because somewhere deep down, we both already knew the answer. Fear. Fear of future forgetting quietly invading present life. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 months earlier, Sandra casually asking, "Do you ever mix up old photos now?" At the time I laughed because the question sounded absurd. Now my stomach turned cold. No, she had already started imagining a future where I might not recognize my own family. I walked slowly into the dining room. More labels. Vacation 1998. Claire's wedding. Richard's retirement. My entire life transformed into categorized prompts. I lowered my voice carefully. "How long have you been planning this?" "Planning what?" "This." Sandra sounded exhausted suddenly. "Mom, after you forgot Ethan's friend's name twice, he changes hairstyles every month. You mixed up 2 old photographs. One was from 1986. You seemed confused. There it was again. Confused, not distracted, not emotional, not human. Symptom language. Fear had quietly rewritten ordinary imperfection into warning signs once more. Then Sandra whispered something that hollowed me completely. The neurologist said familiar visual anchors can help if memory issues develop later. Neurologist. The room tilted slightly around me. What neurologist? Silence, too much silence. And suddenly I knew. They had already discussed me medically without me. I stared down at the label beneath Richard's smiling face. One forgotten name. One mistaken photograph. One difficult year after grief. And suddenly, my daughter quietly started transforming my home into a memory support system for a future version of me that did not yet exist. Then another realization surfaced slowly. For weeks, I whispered, I thought I might be forgetting where I put photographs. The line stayed silent, because there it was again, the real damage. Not the labels. Self-doubt. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to question themselves before questioning the people rearranging their world around them. I spent the next hour pulling labels off frames, not carefully either, angrily. Tiny white stickers curled beneath my fingernails while rain pressed softly against the windows around the house. Richard, husband. Claire, daughter. Ethan, grandson. Each label felt like a small act of surrender someone had already prepared on my behalf. I stacked them into a pile on the dining room table. Little scraps of anticipated decline, then another realization surfaced slowly. Sandra had not only labeled photographs, she had chosen which information mattered most. Relationships, names, dates. As though my life could eventually be reduced to prompts and categories, the thought made me physically ill. Halfway through removing labels from the hallway frames, I noticed one I had missed earlier. ELAINE, Mom. I froze completely. My own photograph. Labeled, not just family members, me. Cold spread painfully through my chest. I stared at the smiling woman inside the frame for several long seconds. Then another horrifying thought surfaced. Had Sandra added that label for me? Or for visitors? The distinction terrified me equally. I called Michael immediately. He answered, sounding distracted. Hey, Mom, did you know about the labels? Silence, too long. There it was again. Not surprise, recognition. You knew, Michael sighed heavily. Sandra thought it might help eventually. Eventually, always eventually. Fear survives comfortably inside future possibilities because no one can prove they will never happen. I stared toward my own labeled photograph. Why is my picture labeled too? Another silence. Then quietly, in case you ever got disoriented. Disoriented, not emotional, not grieving, not overwhelmed. Disoriented. One word repeated often enough slowly transforms identity. I laughed softly. Brokenly, so I could remember who I am. Mom, no, my voice cracked sharply now. Explain that part to me. The room stayed completely still. Because somewhere deep down, he already understood how horrifying it sounded aloud. Then Michael quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. The neurologist mentioned orientation cues. There it was again, the neurologist, not family concern anymore, medical language, institutional concern. I gripped the edge of the dining room chair harder. What neurologist? Michael hesitated, then softly. After the pharmacy incident, Sandra asked for advice. The pharmacy incident. God help me. 3 months earlier, I accidentally picked up the wrong prescription bag because 2 customers shared the same last name. Normal mistake. Human mistake. Yet apparently even that now existed as medical evidence. I stared at the pile of labels scattered across the table. One wrong prescription bag, one forgotten name, one mistaken photograph. And suddenly, my children quietly consulted neurologists about preparing my home for cognitive decline. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. February. Sandra asking casually, do old photographs ever feel blurry emotionally now? At the time I thought she meant grief. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, she was assessing recognition. I sat heavily at the table because suddenly my legs felt weak. What exactly did this neurologist say? Michael rubbed his forehead tiredly through the phone. That memory anchors can reduce confusion if symptoms appear later. Symptoms, not aging, not stress. Symptoms. Fear had quietly transformed ordinary human vulnerability into diagnostic language again. Then Michael admitted something worse. Sandra showed him pictures of the house. The room tilted slightly around me. What? She wanted advice about making things easier. Easier, always easier, never dignified, never normal, easy. I suddenly realized something terrifying. My home no longer fully belonged to me emotionally inside my children's minds. It had become an environment to optimize for possible decline. Then another memory surfaced. Last month, Claire casually asking, "Would you ever consider simplifying the house layout?" At the time, I thought she meant cleaning. God help me. Maybe they were already discussing future cognitive navigation. I looked toward the hallway lined with family photographs, or what used to be family photographs. Now all I could see were invisible labels still hanging there even after removal. Because once fear enters a home, it changes how everything looks afterward. Then Michael whispered something that nearly broke my heart. We thought preparing early would make things less scary later. There it was, the real terror underneath everything, not control. Anticipatory grief. Fear of future forgetting so overwhelming, they started emotionally preparing while I was still fully standing in front of them. I closed my eyes briefly. For weeks, I whispered softly, I genuinely thought I was becoming forgetful because photographs kept moving. The line stayed completely silent, because there it was again. The deepest wound underneath everything. Not the labels. Identity distortion. Instead of questioning why objects around me kept changing, I questioned my own memory first. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to distrust themselves automatically. Then another realization surfaced slowly. The neighbors saw these labels, didn't they? Michael's silence answered before his mouth did. Cold spread slowly through my chest. Mrs. Ellis visiting for tea. Church friends stopping by after Richard's funeral. The repairman fixing the hallway light. All of them quietly seeing labeled family photographs throughout the house. Not Elaine Turner grieving her husband. A woman already being prepared for memory decline. The humiliation burned through me. Then Michael quietly said, "No one judged you." No. That was what made it worse. People probably thought the labels looked compassionate, helpful, responsible, preventive. That was the terrifying part about paternalism. It almost always arrives smiling. I stared toward Richard's photograph again while rain slid softly down the windows outside. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The labels were not really for memory. They were emotional rehearsal. My children quietly practicing for a future, where I might stop recognizing the people I love long before anything like that had actually happened. The next morning, I drove to Sandra's house without calling first, not because I wanted confrontation, because suddenly I needed to see whether the labels existed anywhere else besides my home. Sandra opened the door wearing sweatpants and immediate guilt. Not surprise, guilt, that frightened me instantly. "You came early." I stepped inside without answering. The house smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon candles. Normal home, normal morning. Yet suddenly I felt like I was entering another carefully managed environment. Then I saw it. A white label on Ethan's backpack hanging near the hallway bench. ETHAN school. My stomach tightened, not because children's labels are unusual. Because suddenly I realized Sandra no longer recognized the emotional difference between organizing objects and organizing people. I walked farther into the kitchen. More labels. Pantry, medicine. Bills, important papers, systems everywhere, everything categorized, everything prepared. Sandra followed me carefully, like someone approaching a frightened patient instead of her mother. That hurt more than anger would have. I turned slowly toward her. "When did your house start looking like this?" She blinked. "What? The labels." Sandra looked genuinely confused for a moment. Then softly, "Oh, I've always liked organization." No, I suddenly recognized the tone. The same calm, rational tone people use when something has become emotionally normalized. I stared toward the labeled folders lining her kitchen desk. Then another realization surfaced slowly. The labels in my house probably did not feel frightening to Sandra anymore because she lived inside systems like this constantly herself. Organization had slowly blurred into preparation. Preparation blurred into management. Management blurred into anticipation of decline. Then Sandra quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. After Dad died, everything felt chaotic. Richard again, always Richard. Grief had quietly become the emotional foundation underneath every decision. The labels made things calmer. Interesting word, not clearer, not safer. Calmer. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. So turning my home into a memory support system calmed you. The room stayed silent. Because finally the truth sounded visible spoken aloud. Sandra wrapped both arms around herself tightly. We were scared. Again, always scared, never controlling, never humiliating, scared. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 2 months earlier, Sandra casually asking, "Do you ever forget what room you walked into?" At the time I laughed because everyone forgets that sometimes. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, she had already started screening me mentally. I looked directly at my daughter. "How many times have you tested my memory without telling me?" Her face changed instantly. Fear, real fear. What? The questions. Sandra remained silent, too silent. What room did we eat Christmas dinner in? Do you remember Ethan's teacher's name? Which cousin moved to Arizona? Each question suddenly rearranged itself in my memory, not conversation. Assessment, I stared at her carefully. You were checking me. Tears filled her eyes immediately. We just noticed little things. Little things, interesting phrase, not normal mistakes. Not human forgetfulness. Little things. Fear survives comfortably inside vague evidence because no one can clearly disprove it. Then Sandra whispered something that nearly broke me. The neurologist said families usually notice changes before doctors do. There it was again. The institutional reinforcement. Families notice first. Meaning suspicion itself starts sounding medically responsible. I folded my hands tightly together. Do you know what this did to me? Sandra stayed silent. For months, every time I forgot something ordinary, my voice cracked slightly now, I wondered whether you were secretly counting it. The kitchen went completely still. Because there it was again, the real damage underneath everything, not labels, self-surveillance. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to monitor themselves constantly through imagined observation. Then another realization surfaced suddenly. The photograph labels weren't actually for me, were they? Sandra blinked. What? They were for you. The sentence landed heavily between us, not memory support, emotional reassurance. I stared toward the labeled folders across her kitchen counter. You needed to feel prepared. Sandra covered her mouth instantly, not defensive, not managerial, destroyed. Because finally she understood too. The labels did not merely organize photographs. They emotionally stabilized her fear of future loss. Then Sandra admitted something even worse. The first time you forgot where you put Dad's anniversary card, her voice shook. I cried all night. I stared at her. I misplaced one card, but it scared me. There it was, perfect honesty. Not evidence, fear. Fear had quietly transformed ordinary grief behavior into imagined early decline. Then another memory surfaced. 3 weeks earlier, Mrs. Ellis from church saying gently, "It's wonderful your children are planning ahead, planning ahead." At the time I thought she meant emotional support after Richard's death. God help me. She probably saw the labels. Maybe everyone interpreted them as compassionate preparation for memory problems. I suddenly felt humiliated in a way I could barely describe. Not because people thought I was sick, because people probably thought I already knew. That was the cruelest part. The labels silently announced a future version of me to visitors before I ever consented to living inside that future myself. Then Sandra whispered softly, "We thought if the house became familiar enough now, it might protect you later. Protect you later, always later." The future version of me quietly invading the present again. I looked toward the rain-darkened kitchen window while silence settled heavily around us. And suddenly, I understood something terrifying. My daughter had become so frightened of someday losing my memory. She had already started rearranging my entire world around that possibility long before anything was actually wrong. I removed the rest of the labels that afternoon, every single one, not calmly either. I peeled them from frames, shelves, cabinets, drawers. Tiny white rectangles piling across the dining room table like evidence from some strange emotional crime scene. By evening, my fingertips were raw, but the house finally looked like mine again. Or at least I thought it did. Then I walked into the hallway and froze, because even without the labels physically there anymore, I could still see them. Invisible now, but permanent somehow. Richard, husband. Claire, daughter. Ethan, grandson. Fear changes spaces long after objects disappear. That was the real damage. Then another realization surfaced slowly. If Sandra had consulted a neurologist, how many other people already believed something was wrong with me? I suddenly remembered the church secretary smiling gently last month and saying, "It's wonderful your children are being proactive." Proactive. At the time, I thought she meant helping after Richard's death. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, people had already started discussing me through the language of anticipated decline. That evening, Claire stopped by unexpectedly carrying groceries. The moment she entered the hallway, she noticed the missing labels immediately. Her face changed instantly. Not surprise, fear. "You took them down." Again, not why, just immediate recognition. I folded my arms tightly. "They were labels on family photographs, Claire." She set the grocery bags down slowly. "We thought they might help later." Later again. Always later. Fear survives comfortably inside future possibilities because no one can prove those futures will never happen. I stared at my daughter carefully. "Do you know what they actually did?" Claire remained silent. For weeks, I thought I might be becoming forgetful because things in the house kept changing. The room stayed completely still, because there it was again, the deepest wound underneath everything. Not organization, identity erosion. Instead of questioning why my environment kept shifting, I questioned my own memory first. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to distrust themselves automatically. Then Claire quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. "The first time you forgot Ethan's soccer game," her voice cracked slightly. "I panicked." I stared at her. "I mixed up one Saturday. But it scared me." There it was, again, fear, not evidence. Not diagnosis. Fear. I sat heavily at the dining room table while dusk settled softly through the house. "Do you know how many times your father forgot birthdays?" I asked quietly. Claire blinked. "What? Or repeated stories, or misplaced keys?" The room stayed silent, because suddenly the absurdity became visible. Human beings forget things throughout their entire lives. But older adults forget things beneath observation. That changes interpretation completely. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard standing in the kitchen 20 years earlier laughing because he drove to the wrong grocery store. At the time, everyone found it funny. No one whispered about neurologists. No one prepared labels. Aging changes how ordinary mistakes are socially interpreted. That was the terrifying part. Claire sat slowly across from me. "We weren't trying to erase you." No. I believed her. That was the tragedy underneath everything. No villains, no cruelty, just terrified people slowly preparing emotionally for loss before loss actually arrived. Then Claire whispered something else. "The neurologist said familiar environments can slow confusion later." Slow confusion. Interesting phrase, not improve comfort, not reduce stress. Slow confusion. The future version of me quietly becoming more real inside my children's minds than the current version sitting in front of them. I stared toward Richard's photograph across the hallway. No label now. Yet somehow the absence itself hurt too, because once fear enters a home, nothing ever fully returns to innocence afterward. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. "You all expected me to accept this eventually." Claire's silence answered before her mouth did, not immediately perhaps, but eventually. The labels were emotional groundwork, tiny adjustments preparing me psychologically for future dependency. The realization made me feel cold all over. Then Claire admitted something that nearly broke me. The first time the labels went up, her voice shook slightly. Sandra cried afterward. I stared at her. Why? She said it felt like she was betraying you. The room went completely still, because finally, for the first time, I heard evidence that somewhere deep down, Sandra knew too. Knew the labels crossed some invisible line between helping and preparing to surrender part of my humanity early. Then another memory surfaced. 3 weeks earlier, Michael casually asking, "Do the photographs still comfort you?" At the time I thought he meant emotionally. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, he was checking recognition. Every ordinary family conversation had quietly become evaluation. I looked around the dining room slowly. Family pictures, old furniture, Richard's reading chair near the window, my life, still here. Still intact. Yet somehow everyone around me had already started emotionally rehearsing the possibility that one day I might stop recognizing it all. Then Claire whispered softly, "We just wanted to be ready." Ready, interesting word, not supportive, not loving, ready. Fear had quietly transformed my children from family into anticipatory caregivers long before caregiving was actually necessary. And perhaps the cruelest thing about growing older is this. Sometimes the people who love you become so frightened of future forgetting, they accidentally begin treating your present identity like something temporary. For several days after that, I stopped looking directly at the photographs. Not intentionally, emotionally, because suddenly every frame in the house carried invisible fear attached to it now. I would pass Richard's picture in the hallway and immediately imagine the label beneath it again. Richard, husband, such simple words, yet somehow devastating. The labels had quietly transformed memory into something clinical. That was the part I could not forgive easily. Then another strange thing started happening. I began testing myself constantly. Standing in the kitchen trying to remember dates, repeating grandchildren's birthdays silently while folding laundry, staring at old photographs to make sure names came immediately. That was the real damage, not the labels themselves. Self-surveillance. Fear repeated often enough eventually moves inside older adults too. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and momentarily forgot why I entered. Normal human moment. Everyone does it. Yet panic surged instantly through my chest. There, proof, evidence. I actually stood frozen beside the couch, gripping the blanket tightly, while fear spread slowly through my body. Not because I forgot something important. Because suddenly every ordinary lapse felt medically meaningful. Then another memory surfaced. Richard doing the exact same thing for years. Walking into rooms and laughing, "Now why the hell did I come in here?" Everyone found it charming then. Not alarming. Aging changes interpretation. That was the terrifying part. Later that evening, Susan came over carrying takeout and immediately noticed something wrong. "You look exhausted." I laughed softly. I forgot why I walked into the living room. She stared at me for several long seconds, then simply said, "So?" The simplicity of the question nearly made me cry. So, exactly. Human beings forget things. Human beings lose words. Human beings repeat stories. But older adults experience those moments beneath constant emotional observation. That changes everything. I sat heavily at the kitchen table while Susan unpacked containers. "You know what's strange?" I whispered. "What?" "I don't think the labels were really about memory." The room stayed still. "They were about fear," Susan nodded slowly. "Yes, not because she agreed politely, because she understood immediately. Fear had quietly transformed my children into people rehearsing future, caregiving emotionally long before it became necessary. Then another realization surfaced slowly. And the worst part is they probably thought the labels were compassionate. Susan sighed heavily. That's how paternalism works. Paternalism, there it was, the word underneath everything, soft. Protective, socially approved. and almost impossible to challenge without sounding unstable or ungrateful. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Mrs. Ellis visiting 2 weeks earlier, and gently touching one of the labels before saying, "It's wonderful your children are planning ahead." At the time, I smiled politely because I did not yet understand. Now the humiliation burned through me. People had probably walked through my home, quietly interpreting the labels as evidence of inevitable decline already underway. Not Elaine Turner grieving her husband. A woman slowly disappearing. I stared toward the hallway photographs while rain tapped softly against the windows again. Always rain lately. Then Susan quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. My daughter did something similar after my surgery. I looked up immediately. What? She started labeling pantry shelves so I would get overwhelmed. Overwhelmed? Interesting word, not recovering, not tired, overwhelmed. Susan smiled sadly. The labels disappeared eventually, but the feeling didn't. There it was, perfectly said. Objects can be removed. Interpretation lingers. Then another realization surfaced slowly. For months now, my children had not truly been looking at me. They had been looking at possible future versions of me constantly. Every forgotten name, every repeated question, every emotional moment after Richard's death, all quietly filtered through anticipated decline. That was why ordinary mistakes suddenly carried so much emotional weight. Fear had changed the lens. Then another memory surfaced. 3 months earlier, Sandra casually asking, "Do old memories ever feel fuzzy now?" At the time, I thought she meant emotionally. No. She literally meant memory function. Every conversation now rearranged itself painfully in hindsight. I covered my face briefly with both hands. Then whispered, "I miss being seen normally." The kitchen stayed completely still, because there it was, the deepest wound underneath everything, not labels, not neurologists, normalcy. The quiet dignity of being allowed ordinary human imperfection, without everyone mentally measuring whether it means something worse. Then, Susan reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. "You know what your children forgot?" I looked up. "They forgot that memory isn't the only thing that makes someone themselves." The sentence hit me hard. Because suddenly, I realized something terrifying. My children had become so frightened of future forgetting, they accidentally started reducing my identity to cognitive performance alone. As though remembering perfectly was the only thing separating me from disappearance. But Richard forgot names sometimes. Susan repeated stories constantly. Michael misplaced his keys every week. Human beings are imperfect long before aging enters the conversation. Fear simply teaches people to reinterpret older adults differently. Later that night, after Susan left, I walked slowly through the hallway, turning off lamps one by one. The photographs glowed softly in the dim light. No labels now. No printed categories, just faces. Family, love, memory, human. And suddenly I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not the possibility of forgetting someday. It is realizing how quickly the people who love you begin quietly preparing for that possibility long before anything is actually wrong. Because once fear enters a family, ordinary human mistakes stop looking ordinary. They start looking like prophecy. A week later, Sandra came over alone. No soup containers, no grocery bags, no quiet organizing projects, just herself. That alone felt different somehow. She stood awkwardly in the hallway for several seconds staring at the photographs. No labels now, just frames, faces. Memories, her eyes filled almost immediately. "I'm sorry," she whispered. There it was finally. Not explanation, not justification, recognition. I leaned against the doorway quietly. "For which part?" Sandra laughed softly through tears. "All of it." The house stayed completely still around us. Rain moved softly against the windows outside, while afternoon light settled across the hallway frames. Then Sandra walked slowly toward Richard's photograph. No label beneath it now, just his smile. "The neurologist asked whether you'd ever gotten lost in familiar places," she whispered. I closed my eyes briefly. There it is again. What? You all stopped seeing grief as grief. The room went silent, because finally the real thing sat clearly between us. After Richard died, I wandered sometimes. Forgot things, repeated stories, misplaced objects, not because I was disappearing cognitively, because grief rearranges the brain temporarily. But fear had quietly translated every vulnerable moment into possible evidence instead. Sandra sat slowly on the couch. I think losing Dad broke something in all of us. Yes, exactly. That was what made all of this so tragic. Not cruelty, panic, fear of losing one parent quietly transforming into terror about losing the other. Then Sandra admitted something that hollowed me completely. The first time you forgot where a photograph used to sit, her voice cracked slightly. I thought it had started. Started. Interesting word. Not happened once. Not emotional exhaustion. Started. As though decline itself had already become an invisible timeline quietly progressing beneath my life. I sat across from her carefully. Do you know what actually started? Sandra looked up slowly. I started doubting myself. The room stayed completely still, because there it was again. The deepest wound underneath everything. Not labels. Self-erasure. For months, every missing object or forgotten detail became private evidence against myself before I ever questioned anyone else. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. March. Standing in the hallway staring at an empty space on the bookshelf, trying desperately to remember whether Richard's lake photograph had always been there. At the time, I genuinely believed my memory might be slipping. God help me. The photograph had simply been moved by my daughter. I folded my hands tightly together. You taught me to question my own reality before questioning yours. Sandra covered her mouth instantly. Not guilt, not fear, recognition, because finally she understood, not intellectually. Emotionally, the labels were not merely preparation. They slowly trained me to distrust my own mind. Then Sandra whispered something that nearly broke my heart. I thought preparing early would protect your dignity later. Dignity, interesting word, not preserve autonomy, not maintain trust. Dignity. Fear had quietly convinced her that future preparation justified present humiliation. I looked toward the photographs lining the hallway. Sandra at graduation, Michael fishing with Richard, Claire dancing barefoot in the backyard, an entire life. Still here, still mine. Then another realization surfaced slowly. You know what frightens me most? Sandra remained silent. For a while, I actually started testing myself every day. Her face crumpled immediately. Testing, birthdays, names, dates. My voice shook slightly now. I'd walk into rooms and panic if I forgot why. The tears finally slipped down Sandra's face completely then, because finally she understood the true consequence. Not hurt feelings. Psychological conditioning. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to monitor themselves constantly through imagined decline. Then Sandra quietly admitted something else. After the labels went up, her voice cracked. I couldn't sleep the first night. I stared at her. Why? Because the house suddenly looked like you were already gone. The room went completely silent, and suddenly I understood everything. The labels were not really for me at all. They were grief rehearsal. My daughter quietly practicing for future loss while I was still standing fully alive inside the house. That realization broke something open inside me. Not anger, sadness. Because finally, I saw the entire shape of it clearly. My children had not stopped loving me. They had simply become so frightened of future forgetting that they accidentally started treating my present identity like something fragile and temporary. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard forgetting movie titles constantly during the last 10 years of his life. No one panicked. No one labeled cabinets, because middle-aged forgetfulness feels human. Elderly forgetfulness feels diagnostic. That was the terrifying difference. Sandra stood slowly and walked toward the hallway again. She touched Richard's photograph gently. Then whispered, I think we became so afraid of someday losing pieces of you, we stopped trusting the pieces that were still completely here. The sentence settled heavily through the quiet house. Because finally, maybe for the first time, my daughter understood the actual damage underneath everything. not organization, not preparation. The gradual emotional disappearance that begins when older adults stop being treated like fully reliable narrators of their own lives. Later that night, after Sandra left, I stood alone in the hallway with the lights dimmed low. The photographs glowed softly around me. No labels, no categories, no prompts, just memory, just family. Just life. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not the possibility of forgetting someday. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly transform ordinary human imperfection into evidence of future disappearance. One forgotten name, one misplaced photograph, one difficult season after grief. Tiny moments repeated emotionally until the people who love you begin preparing for your absence long before you are actually gone. And sometimes, by the time they finally understand they went too far, you have already spent months learning what it feels like to slowly disappear inside everyone else's fear.